Was Patton a genius or a madman? Picture this. December 16th, 1944. A wall of snow, roads rimed with ice, and the tiny town of Bastogne surrounded. Men huddled in foxholes as temperatures plummeted toward -15 Celsius. The sky was low with fog. No planes could fly. The 101st Airborne, battered and outnumbered, held a ring of frozen defenses while German armor punched toward the Allied rear. For weeks, the war in Europe had felt like a grinding march forward. Now, one sudden push threatened to choke the supply veins that fed the Allied armies, and with them, the possibility of a swift end to the war. Before we go further, a word about the framing device at the center of this episode. The diary excerpts you'll hear are presented here as a dramatized composite of contemporary impressions by a doctor close to the command echelon. They are not offered as clinical proof or a certified medical record, but as a way to catch the mood, the human pulse, behind the maps and radio reports. His hands would not rest on the table. The diary begins. Maps like coals beneath him. It is a short, uneasy line, the kind that makes you ask whether restlessness is merely temperament or something more. The stakes could not have been higher. Bastogne sits at a crossroads. 7 key roads converge there. If the Germans had held it, they would have severed the Allied line to Antwerp, the deep water port that had become the lifeline for fuel, ammunition, and reinforcement. Lose Antwerp, and the Allies would face a logistical choke so severe it might slow or even stall operations for months. Around 12 to 20,000 Allied troops were at risk inside and near Bastogne. The larger strategic picture made the situation urgent beyond measure. On December 16th, the Germans, under their 5th Panzer Army, launched a massive assault through the Ardennes. It was surprise, speed, and cold. American units, thinly spread, watched columns of tanks and veterans surge through the trees. For the Allies, the immediate question was not just where the enemy was moving, but how to stop him without giving up the hard-won momentum of months of advance. At Chafe, Eisenhower gathered his commanders to weigh options. Some argued for patience, reinforce, consolidate, wait for clearer weather and for air power to reassert control. Others feared the cost of delay. Then, from the south, a voice cut across the maps and the debate. George S. Patton, commander of 3rd Army, who had been operating on a different axis, suddenly offered a solution that sounded to many in that room almost reckless. He could pivot his entire force and strike toward Bastogne within 48 hours. The room went quiet. 48 hours. It was not a measured staff estimate. It was an assertion from a man famous for moving faster than logistic planners thought prudent. He later put it differently in the simplest of ways. 4 words over the wire that carried the weight of a gamble. I can attack now. Before that attack, a second diary line. He slept little that night. The maps kept changing in his mind. Short, bare. It captures the image of a commander whose calendar and conscience raced in parallel. To understand why Patton's claim was so astonishing, imagine the mechanics of what he proposed. 3rd Army was not a single nimble unit, but a sprawling force. Armored columns, infantry divisions, truck convoys, maintenance crews, fuel trains. To turn that whole machine 90 degrees on a frozen, narrow highway network in winter, with bridges damaged, with roads clogged by retreating units, with supply trains needing rerouting, meant threading a needle through a storm. Logistics, in modern warfare, are the invisible front. Speed is only useful if fuel, ammunition, and spare parts arrive where and when the troops need them. Patton's gamble leaned on momentum. Keep moving, and enemies will be forced to react. Pause long enough to plan perfectly, and the opponent will enmesh your options. He favored initiative. He trusted shock, not for show, but as a way to buy time and space. So the pivot began. The mechanics were ugly and heroic at once. Convoys crawled over black ice. Drivers cursed the roads and the cold. Bridges had to be inspected and, where possible, repaired. Traffic jams formed as columns converged onto the few reliable routes through the Ardennes. Commanders rode in jeeps, radios chattered, and officers rerouted whole supply trains on paper maps, while men pushed vehicles out of ditches with frozen hands. The 4th Armored Division under General Hugh Gaffey would be a spearhead. Elements of the 10th Armored and Infantry formations, among them components tied to the 26th and 81st outfits, threaded toward the beleaguered town. It was coordination at the ragged edge of possibility. A diary entry reads now, quieter. On the road his face was unreadable. I wondered if fear or fuel drove him. It is a small human note in a ledger of maneuvers. It hints at the thing that has always made Patton such a contentious figure, an almost single-minded appetite for motion that could read as brilliance or as disregard. There were practical miracles. Winter weather that had grounded aircraft began to relent. When the fog lifted, Allied planes returned, strafing enemy columns and dropping desperately needed supplies. Pilots guided parachute drops into Bastogne, hot chow and ammunition, even winter clothing, were forced through the sky to men who had been short for days. Ground units fought through the obstacle course of snow-packed roads and German resistance, inching closer with a relentless rhythm. The campaign was not a single glorious dash so much as a sustained squeeze, pressure from multiple directions, timing that brought relief. On December 26th, 10 days after the offensive began and a week after Patton vowed he could swing in, elements of Patton's Third Army and other Allied units linked up with the defenders at Bastogne. The siege was broken. Some 20,000 soldiers were effectively rescued from an encirclement that, for a time, had looked like a nightmare. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. Its docks continued to flow. The German offensive stalled and then ebbed away. What might have been months of logistical collapse and extended campaigning was avoided, largely because forces reacted swiftly enough to blunt the thrust. That achievement is the core evidence for those who argue genius. Patton saw that inertia could be fatal. He grasped at a strategic lever, momentum, and applied it ruthlessly. His decision-making process was fast: assess, decide, move. In the tight hours of crisis, that speed translated into outcomes. For many of those men in the cold, the return to supply, to warm food, to reinforcements, was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Yet to call him purely a genius is to overlook the costs and the character that carried the costs. Patton's style was often abrasive. He could be cavalier about casualties, and his appetite for offensive action sometimes ignored prudent caution. Every rapid maneuver rolls dice. Sometimes the dice fall your way, sometimes they do not. Had weather been worse a week longer? Had bridges failed? Had the Germans anticipated the pivot more effectively, the gamble could have gone badly, with heavy losses. Critics then and later note that Patton's bravado could edge toward recklessness. There is also the moral dimension. Leadership in war is not only about winning ground, but about the lives entrusted to a single signature. A commander who repeatedly prefers audacity over deliberation invites moral scrutiny. The line between calculated risk and wanton endangerment is not an abstract one for the families of the fallen, yet the counter is equally human. When men are trapped, when supply lines are severed, hesitation has a cost measured in flesh. So where does the diary fit in all this? The snippets, the restless hands on maps, the unreadable face on a jeep, the laughter after relief, are not clinical verdicts. They are human impressions. The dramatized composite we use here captures how those close to command perceived Patton, a man who moved at a velocity equal parts intellect, temperament, and appetite. He was capable of decisions that, in the cool light of study, read as stroke of genius maneuvers. In the heat of action, they felt like leaps. In the end, the verdict must be complicated. If genius is the ability to read a battlefield's tempo and shift its rhythm, Patton showed that gift in December 1944. His choice to pivot and the machine that carried that choice to Bastogne produced a strategic rescue with consequences that rippled through the final months of the European war. If madness is a pattern of irrational decisions that disregard basic realities and needlessly cost lives, then the evidence is thinner. Yes, he risked much, but those risks were often informed by an understanding of momentum and of the fragile mathematics of supply and movement. A final line from the diary, soft now. He laughed like a man who'd outrun a storm, or invited it in. There is the ambivalence, admiration braided with unease. In the frozen roads of the Ardennes, Patton's audacity bought time and lives. It also reminded those who watched that great victory sometimes rides on a narrow ridge between brilliance and danger. So was Patton a genius or a madman? He was neither only one nor the other. He was a commander who trusted motion as a kind of reasoning, who accepted risk as the currency of decisive action. In Bastogne, that currency paid off. But the line he walked was thin, and history is right to keep watching how often audacity leads to salvation rather than ruin. If you think another commander could have done what Patton did, write their name in the comments below. Who else would you have trusted with that kind of gamble? And before you go, vote in the comments. Genius or madman? Share this with someone who remembers stories from that winter of 1944, and subscribe for more deep dives into the decisions that shaped the 20th century.